Hello, welcome. So let's recap Genesis. So the book started with creation, and there we talked about creation, how we understand the days, whether a day was a day or a period of time or an eon, or whether there were gaps between the days. But again, in as we discussed in the ancient Near Eastern mind, something didn't exist until it had a function. It could be understood that way. I listened to some scientists talk about how if creation would have been 6.13 billion years ago, and you take into consideration how gravity distorts times, that 13.6 billion years ago creation would have been, I don't know, 6 days or something, or 13.6 billion years would be 6 days, something like that. In any case, the whole point is we are here, and God created men and women, and then they fell into sin, and that is the thing that still has an effect on us. And then of course they had children, Cain and Abel. And then the first truly, well, they sinned before that, but the first murder, that's when the first murder we learn happened. And then what we see that violence just spread throughout the land. That's why at the time of Noah, God decided to wipe out humanity by bringing about the flood. We talked about whether it was a local flood or whether it was a global flood. Again, there are things about it. I learned something interesting. Apparently, there was a talk that they discovered that deep inside the crust of the earth, there's actually more water than on the surface, in the oceans or lakes and things like that. So that's an interesting thing to look into. Then we saw the Tower of Babel, where people wanted to grow and become greater, and we were talking about that one of the reasons why God was angry could have been that what people understood is that in the towers the gods lived, so they almost like try to reduce God to a building. But again, also we were talking about people would be concentrated on a land, and a land wouldn't have been able to support people. So it was actually better that they were taught to spread out around the world. That this way, because the language was confused, people actually had no choice but do it. Then we met Abraham, who got called by God, and what was interesting was that Abraham wasn't the Abraham we know him. The Paul talks about the faith of Abraham, what a great man he was. We can see that he was still he was still on milk, not solid food. Back in the day when we meet him, he didn't exactly, when God called him, he didn't exactly go. He was still staying there for a time being. Then we saw the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we were talking about the evil things that happened there, and the horrible things that people did, and there were not even 10 righteous people there, because God would have saved them. And then we learned about it was almost like the Trinity was hidden in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then we meet again Abraham, how God tried his faith, and that was the key word, that we are going to return. So it was Abraham knew that one way or another him and Isaac would return after the sacrifice, after the event. Then we met Jacob, who who sort of tricked his father out of the blessing. So he got the blessing instead of Esau. Then he fled to Laban, and then he was working for the wife, and he got tricked the same way he tricked his father. Then he became rich, then he came back. So as he came back, his daughter was raped, and that's when we saw that there was a bloodbath. Then Joseph was born, and when he got older, we saw that he had a dream that his brothers and his father and everybody would bow down to him. But the brothers didn't take it well, and they decided to get rid of him. So first they wanted to kill him, but then they decided they would just only sell him. And that's how he ended up in Egypt at the house of Potiphar, who lifted him up. But the wife wanted a little bit more than him being a servant, which he refused, and the wife was lying about him. That's how he ended up in jail. And we discussed that the husband might have known, otherwise he would have had him killed, but he had to save face. Then in the jail he was able to interpret dreams. Then that's how he got out of the jail, because he was remembered that he was able to interpret dreams by God, and the Pharaoh had this dream which was showing that on the land of Egypt there would be 7 years of wealth and 7 years of famine. And because they prepared for the 7 years of famine, they had a surplus of food, which is what the brothers of Joseph went down to Egypt to buy. And that's how he met the brothers. And then after having a little bit of a shenanigan, he revealed himself to be Joseph. Then he actually met his father later. Then the whole family came down to Egypt, and then all the main characters died, like a good book. But what we have to remember is we can see how God works through the story. We can see how God was making covenants with people, how after the people fell into sin, he was still directing the events. That you could see that they were showing these Christ figures, how Christ, the Father, would sacrifice his son. We could see the story of, we could see Christ hidden in the Old Testament, hidden in plain sight, if you will. So the book of Genesis shows off creation, sin, and then how the people of Israel end up in Egypt. And then we're going to see in the book of Exodus how God brings them out of Egypt. Amen.